It's one of the great success stories in crop production history. Tomatoes grown for processing in the 1980s averaged 25 tons an acre, sometimes reaching slightly more on rare occasions. Today, an average field planted in the Central Valley produces 50 tons per acre and often reaches over 60 tons an acre if conditions are ideal. Technology has driven this increase. New hybrid varieties with concentrated fruit set and stronger disease resistance played a role in greater production and improved quality characteristics.
Adoption of subsurface strip led to a dramatic increase in water efficiency and enabled direct placement of nutrients in the root zone through extensively studied timing of applications to match plant demand. When each plant in a well-managed field receives optimal amounts of water and nutrients and protection against pests, production can regularly meet those remarkable yields.
Is there a right way to grow tomatoes to achieve these consistent high yields? Top agronomists in both private industry and universities are saying yes, especially when it comes to managing the very important nutrient nitrogen. Of course, proper plant nutrition is complex and involves more than just nitrogen fertilization.
Other nutrients, including phosphorus, potassium, calcium, zinc, and sulfur, are also essential.
Lately, there has been a lot of attention paid to nitrogen and nitrate, the form that can leach into groundwater. Many groundwater basins in the Central Valley are contaminated with nitrate at levels exceeding safe drinking water standards. The State Water Board is responding by adopting a nitrate control program that will affect each industry in California where nitrogen is used as an input or waste discharges contain nitrate. Testing of groundwater basins in the Central Valley is finding that some portion of the contamination is attributable to the application to irrigated cropland of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, compost, and animal manures. Other nitrate sources are also identified: livestock operations, wastewater treatment plants, and natural sources.
Agronomists have devised a management approach for optimizing applications of nitrogen to crops to minimize leaching of excess nitrate while optimizing crop production. The approach is called the 4 R's: the right rate, right time, right place, and right source. For processing tomatoes, the University of California, with support from the California Department of Food and Agriculture, has spent years refining the 4 R's and now has proven practices ready to be used today in California processing tomato production. Before going into details on the 4 R's, it's important to understand the relationship between soils, nitrogen fertilization, and irrigation practices. In particular, how nitrate moves in the soil and how it is taken up by a tomato plant, essentially how all the science turns into management implications and tools. A fundamental point to remember: any nitrogen source can convert to nitrate and eventually leach beyond the root zone and into groundwater aquifers.
Other factors are in play with nitrate, such as mineralization, losses to the atmosphere, and biological processes. However, the leaching of excess nitrate from irrigated cropland to groundwater is a major focus these days and deserves much attention.
First, we have to understand why nitrogen is important for plants. Plants use more nitrogen than any other nutrient. For tomatoes, over 2/3 of the nitrogen goes into fruit and 1/3 or less in the vines. Nitrogen plays critical roles in performing certain functions in plants and is closely linked with phytohormones such as abscisic acid, auxin, and cytokinins. Nitrogen is also critical for chloroplasts as part of the chlorophyll molecule, which are the plant's sugar-making factories, and the plants need nitrogen for defense against abiotic and biotic stresses. When nitrogen is deficient in the plant, it can limit growth and cause leaf chlorosis. Conversely, too much nitrogen can cause excessive vegetative growth and yield reduction.
Before planting, it's important to perform a soil test to understand how much nitrogen is available for the planting. Soil samples for nitrogen should be taken before the first nitrogen application of the season, either before planting or before the first in-season nitrogen application. Tomatoes have a relatively shallow root system, with majority of roots accumulating at a depth of 4 to 16 inches.
Soil samples should be taken to a depth of 1 to 2 feet. The soil nitrate test measures the plant available nitrogen at the time of sampling. Therefore, the test results is field specific and it needs to be determined every year.
Nitrate, as the major form of nitrogen, is directly available for plant uptake. The value in the rooting zone can be subtracted from the crop nitrogen requirements to determine the amount of nitrogen fertilizer needed for applications, either pre-plant or fertigation during the growing season.
As tomato takes up less than 30% of the required nitrogen before fruit set, the need of pre-plant nitrogen application is often minimal after taking into account of the soil residual nitrogen measured from soil test. A starter nitrogen application may be needed before transplanting as a blend with phosphorus. Additional nitrogen applications may not be needed until the plant passes the transplant shock stage and it begins growing rapidly. Keep in mind that too much nitrogen can cause excess vegetative growth and increase the risk of nitrate leaching. Excess nitrogen fertilization can also lead to increased disease susceptibilities.
So a key component of the 4 R's is the right amount of nitrogen. Research has shown that on average, a tomato crop needs 4.6 pounds of nitrogen per ton of tomatoes.
Researchers came up with that number by analyzing the nitrogen content in the plants and harvested fruit in a well-managed field. The tomato plant used that 4.6 pounds of nitrogen from the flowering stage until fruit just begins to turn red. We want the right amount in the plant when plant needs it and where it can get it.
To help understand how to effectively manage nitrogen applications, you need to understand the different forms of nitrogen in the soil and how nitrogen is taken up by tomato plants. These are basically the 3 forms of nitrogen in the soil: soil organic matter, ammonium, and nitrate. Soil organic matter is the nutrient storage bank in your soil.
In the short term, organic matter nitrogen is tied up in big, complex organic molecules that are not immediately available to plants. But over time, this organic matter breaks down and provides a steady supply of ammonium and nitrate to the soil and the tomato roots. Ammonium and nitrate are the forms of nitrogen that tomato can take up. Being positively charged, ammonium can stick to soil particles which are predominantly negatively charged and hence does not leach easily.
Nitrate is the other form of nitrogen that roots can take up from the soil. However, nitrate is negatively charged, so it cannot stick to soil particles, making it susceptible to leaching. As a reminder, when we talk about the cation exchange capacity in soils, we mean the ability of a soil to temporarily hold on to positively charged molecules. Ammonium is one of those positively charged molecules typically found in soil.
How do these forms of nitrogen cycle in the soil? Let's start with soil organic matter. As organic matter is broken down by soil microbes, it releases ammonium. In warm, moist soils, this can occur in a matter of weeks to months, while in cold soils, for example, below 55 Fahrenheit, this can be a very slow process. Because this process is driven by microbial activity in the soil, it's very complex.
As with all biological processes, it happens faster when moisture is present, when there is oxygen for microbes to use, and when temperatures are warmer. When you apply organic amendments such as compost, you stimulate microbial activity, and those microbes require nitrogen and carbohydrates to reproduce and confer the job. If the compost is less than 2% nitrogen, any nitrogen is going to be tied up by those microbes for a period of time until those microbes die. So if compost is applied as a supplement to conventional fertilizer, it's important to understand the nitrogen content of the compost, since its availability to the plant can be delayed until compost breaks down.
Once nitrogen is in the ammonium form, it can then turn into nitrate through a process called nitrification. Nitrification is also microbe-driven, so the rate at which this occurs depends primarily on temperature.
In California soils during the growing season, nitrification happens in a matter of days to weeks.
As a consequence of this rapid microbial action, the nitrogen in soil organic matter converts to ammonium, which turns into nitrate and is leachable if it's not taken up by the plant. Same goes for fertilizer urea. It quickly converts to ammonium, which also turns into nitrate, which can leach if it's not taken up by the plant.
So how does nitrogen in organic matter and ammonium turn into nitrate?
How fast does this happen? At 50 degrees Fahrenheit, it takes 4 weeks for 40% of ammonium present to convert into nitrate. At around 60 degrees, in the top 2 to 3 inches of soil, 60% of ammonium that you apply will turn into nitrate in just 2 weeks if it's not taken up by the plants. At 75 degrees, it only takes 2 weeks for 100% of the ammonium to turn into nitrate.
Now let's talk about how nitrogen moves in plants. Nitrogen uptake in tomato is closely related to tomato growth stages. Early in the season, nitrogen need and uptake is low. Most of the seasonal growth and nitrogen uptake occurs between early fruit set and the early red fruit stage. The amount of nitrogen uptake after the red fruit stage becomes minimal as the nitrogen is translocating from leaves and stems into fruit, where 70% of the total above ground nitrogen is located.
If you over-apply beyond what is needed, the response to yield enhancement is very minimal. And there's a point of diminishing return since most of the nitrogen applied will not be taken up by the roots. Which all means that more nitrogen applied does not necessarily mean more nitrogen is taken up. Matching the crop demand and the growth pattern is the rule of thumb for yield assurance and a return on investment.
All this science about how nitrogen behaves in the soil and in plants has to be translated into practices for managing a tomato planting. Let's start with the right rate. Applying the right rate is about matching nitrogen supply with tomato plant nitrogen demand. That demand is all the nutrients a plant needs to grow the leaves, stems, and fruit.
This is our supply side. Cover crops, manure, compost, the nitrate in irrigation water, and of course, synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. For non-fertilizer sources, which include residual soil nitrate, nitrate in irrigation water, legume cover crop including alfalfa, crop residual nitrate, nitrogen mineralization from soil organic matter, compost and manure nitrogen credits, and fertilizer nitrogen.
Before we go on, let's talk a minute about nitrate in irrigation well water, or as it's being called, pump and fertilize. Years of research has shown that this nitrate is available for plants to absorb and use just like any other source of nitrogen. An inexpensive well test can tell you exactly how much nitrate is in your irrigation water.
Here's how to do the math. Take the test results, say 10 parts per million, and multiply by 0.226. That equals 2.26 pounds of nitrogen per acre inch of water applied to the field. If you apply 36 acre inches or 3 acre feet of water during the growing season, the total is 81 pounds of nitrogen per acre each year.
Of course, not all nitrate coming from the irrigation water will be taken up by tomatoes. There's one more step. You need to multiply that 81 pounds times the crop nitrogen use efficiency and efficiency of your irrigation system. As a rough estimate, let's use 90% efficiency for both as an example. At 10 parts per million and 90% efficiency, you should include about 73 pounds of nitrogen per acre in your overall nitrogen budget just from your irrigation water.
Think of it this way. That's 73 pounds of free nitrogen applied to your crop. Better yet, you're helping clean up the groundwater aquifer. Some of the nitrogen that isn't used by the plant can cycle in the soil, but generally any excess nitrate is susceptible to leaching into groundwater. This can occur with any type of irrigation system.
Translated to a management practice, this means spoon feeding or applying smaller amounts over multiple applications. The more split applications, the better. So how do we arrive at the right rate? Plant samples were collected throughout the season at 3-week intervals. Plants and fruits were picked and weighed, then dried separately and analyzed for total nitrogen content. Results from these fields revealed that little nitrogen was taken up during the first month after transplanting. On average, less than 15% of the total above-ground nitrogen was taken up during this period, which in most fields was less than 50 pounds per acre. A moderate starter fertilizer application can therefore supply enough nitrogen during the initial 3 to 4 weeks after transplanting. The initial period of slow nitrogen uptake was followed by 8 to 10 weeks of rapid uptake, with daily uptake rates reaching 7 pounds per acre in some fields. On average, more than 80% of the total nitrogen in the above-ground biomass had been taken up by the time the plants reached the early red fruit stage. An adequate nitrogen supply is crucial during this period of high nitrogen demand, and the nitrogen fertigation should be timed to avoid temporary nitrogen limitations. During the last month before harvest, nitrogen uptake could be low, and in some cases, a decrease in the total biomass nitrogen was observed. After the crop reaches the early red fruit stage, nitrogen applications usually do not warrant yield increase, or say yield response to continuous nitrogen application is usually very minimal. Late applications may not be taken up by the plants and are at risk of leaching during the winter. The results of the study show that on average, 4.6 pounds of nitrogen was removed in every ton of harvested tomatoes. So our right rate is about 4.6 pounds per ton of tomatoes.
While we don't consider this to be an official nitrogen removed number for tomatoes used for regulatory purposes, you should consider it a baseline number to build your nitrogen budget.
Now let's talk about the right time. Applying the right amount of nitrogen at the right time requires knowledge about the crop nitrogen demand, the seasonal uptake pattern, and the availability of other sources of nitrogen. For drip irrigated tomatoes, there is generally no need for foliar applications. So applying at the right time is about matching the timing of plant demand with root uptake. Because it takes energy to take up nutrients, a plant will do it when they need those nutrients.
The UCC studies found that nitrogen uptake differs dramatically based on the plant growth stage. Because plant demand varies throughout the growing season, this informs us on how to split our nitrogen applications. Applying at the peak nitrogen use stages, flowering, fruit set, and fruit sizing goes a long way to increasing your nitrogen use efficiency, increasing plant uptake, and minimizing nitrate leaching. We also know that the plant begins using nitrogen 5 to 6 weeks after transplanting, after the plants are acclimated. So it's not worth applying nitrogen too early because roots are not taking up nitrogen yet, leaving it to potentially leach out by rain or irrigation. Similarly, once the fruit is turning red, nitrogen applications are less able to be taken up by the plant and should be avoided.
One of the best tools to guide your decisions on the right amount and right time is through leaf analysis. Tomato growers have been using leaf nutrient analysis for more than 20 years to check plant nitrogen status, typically pulling leaf samples at the early bloom stage, which is the critical stage of nitrogen demands. Leaf sampling results can provide valuable information to help you design a rational, plant-based fertilization regime. Petiole analysis can also be used to estimate crop nitrogen status. However, we recommend whole leaf analysis because it provides a more reliable estimate of crop nutrient status. This is because leaf analysis measures all forms of nitrogen, and nitrogen changes more slowly in leaves than in the petioles, making the results less dependent on the sampling date.
The University of California recently completed supporting research for leaf samples. A team led by Dr. Tim Hartz from University of California, Davis, conducted a survey from over 100 commercial processing tomato fields. Optimal nutrient concentration for high-yielding tomatoes is within a range depending on measuring time. Having the results early enables growers to react quickly by either holding off additional applications if nitrogen levels are adequate, or adding fertilizer if a deficiency is apparent. These new critical nitrogen values for leaf sampling are in the process of being posted on a calculator in CropManage, an interactive online decision support tool developed by the University of California, where your lab results can be compared to appropriate ranges.
Leaf sampling can be easily done following a few simple steps. The first leaf sample can be taken at early flowering stage. Stake out an area of about 20 square feet. For a representative sample, pull the fourth leaves from the tip, about 40 total, and place them in a clean paper bag. If there are dramatically different soil types, subdivide the field into blocks based on the soil type and take proportional leaf samples from each area. The key point is to make sure the leaves collected are representative of the majority of plants in an area of the field. Put all your leaflets in a paper bag, label the bag with a field identification, and send them to your nutrient analysis lab of choice as quickly as possible. If temperatures are warm, keep the leaf samples in an ice chest. Instruct the lab to analyze for nitrogen and also the other key elements of phosphorus and potassium.
At first bloom, nitrogen levels for a potentially high-yielding field should be between 4.6 and 5.2. At full bloom, the range should be between 3.5 and 4.5, while this range is 2.7 to 3.8 at 10% fruit showing red. The farther outside these ranges are measured, the more likely the nutrient is deficient or excessive in availability. Results from all these nutrients in combination will better guide recommendations if changes in applications are needed. Once you receive the leaf sample results, the nitrogen values can be input into CropManage. Also include results for other nutrients into your CropManage worksheet. Leaf sampling results can inform your yield-based nitrogen management strategy to better match crop needs to your yield estimates.
So where is the right place to apply nitrogen fertilizers? Applying in the right place means knowing where the majority of roots are and applying nitrogen where roots can best take up any nutrients and water as well. Fertigation is the preferred mode of application that will synchronize nitrogen additions with plant demand and to the root zone. Think back to when you saw a tomato plant uprooted. Look closely at where all the roots are located below the soil level.
Typically, the vast majority of important feeder roots are in the top 4 to 16 inches of soil. Roots will be shallower in young plants and root depth will change as the plant grows. So it's in that upper zone where you want to keep your water and nutrient applications. And remember, nitrate moves with water, so if you push water below the root zone, you risk pushing nutrients below the root zone also.
Root distribution in a tomato field can vary dramatically if you compare furrow irrigation to high-efficiency systems such as subsurface drip lines. The point is this: the active roots will always be in the same location that irrigation water is applied. This is why fertigation, injecting fertilizer during the irrigation, is the most efficient method when using high-efficiency systems. And speaking of fertigation, always inject the fertilizer at the last half or quarter of an irrigation set, stopping the injection 10 to 15 minutes before the set is finished to ensure the system is adequately flushed.
The right source is about preventing the applied nitrogen from converting too quickly into nitrate and leaching beyond the roots. Tomato plants can take up both ammonium and nitrate. Research has indicated that tomatoes are sensitive to ammonium. Under field conditions in California, ammonium can quickly convert to nitrate. Again, nitrate is negatively charged and can move through the soil very easily, so keep that in mind when choosing nitrogen fertilizer and managing its application.
There's a lot that goes into selecting the right source. In particular, how much do you want to spend per acre? What application method is used? Side dressing or fertigating through drip? There are many nitrogen fertilizer product options, but each has its own baggage. Calcium nitrate is a readily available form of a nitrogen, but also has a high leaching potential. This leaching potential can be managed with well-timed applications, and calcium nitrate is well suited to fertigation systems. The calcium in calcium nitrate can also be helpful for plant health. Urea ammonium nitrate is very popular due to its solubility. The mixture of nitrogen forms makes this a slightly less leachable form of nitrogen, although in warm spring and summer conditions, the conversion to nitrate is very rapid.
There are lots of reasons why you are making fertilizer choices, but always keep in mind the vulnerability inherent with each choice. When applying compost or manure, remember these materials need time to mineralize and convert to ammonium, making it plant available. A rule of thumb for compost is that about 40% of nitrogen is available in the first year after application, another 30% the following year, then the balance is released over several years. Depending on the type of compost, this form of organic fertilizer averages about 2 to 4% nitrogen content. So if you apply 4 tons per acre, nitrogen available the first year would be about 96 pounds per acre.
And remember, availability of the nitrogen from compost is very temperature dependent. Where possible, incorporate compost or manure soon after application. When choosing a commercial nitrogen fertilizer, consider how much and when the nitrogen is available for plant uptake.
Be mindful of the amount of water applied in irrigations during and after fertilizer applications. Too much water can push excess nitrates past the root zone. Ask your supplier or crop advisor for the best material for your conditions and soil type.
Finally, let's pull together a right rate, time, place, and source into one calculation.
First, you have to consider yield history of each field, the current year growing conditions, and a variety being planted, and use that information to develop a realistic yield potential of, say, a 60-ton crop. We are going to assume a 80 to 90% nitrogen use efficiency to get nitrogen into the plants.
For example, our projected yield is 60 tons per acre times 4.6 pounds per ton, divided by the 90% efficiency factor, and that equals 306 pounds of nitrogen per acre taken up by tomato plants during the growing season. Use this calculation to apply to your situation. All numbers here can be replaced to reflect your production goal. That's our targeted yield.
We will take consideration of irrigation water, irrigation efficiency, any amendments you're going to add, and soil test.
Subtracting those sources, let's say nitrogen fertilizer requirement is 200 pounds per acre. If a starter fertilizer is applied, that will cover plant growth for the first 3 to 4 weeks. Bloom time is another high nitrogen use period followed by fruit sizing. We know that the growing fruit is the biggest nitrogen demander. For example, a 30-pound rate is applied as the starter nitrogen.
We can then divide the 170 pounds into a number of fertigation events. For example, 8 fertigation events will make about a 21 pound per acre per fertigation event. This will ensure the best placement for the nutrient to be absorbed by tomato roots.
According to your need and budget, choose different forms of a nitrogen, either blended with phosphorus at the beginning of the season or with potash and calcium during the season for supplementing crop demands and maintaining fruit quality.
Following these simple steps will go a long way toward increasing your nitrogen use efficiency and decreasing nitrate leaching to the groundwater. Best of all, it ensures you get the most value from an expensive crop input, and in this market, saving every dollar counts.